Hello and welcome to this special episode of Epochs, where I shall be talking all about the history of Russia and Ukraine. And I am joined by the brilliant Apostolic Majesty. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I mean, we had a bit of an incident in terms of being able to arrange this, but no, I'm glad we're finally here, and always glad to be on the show and to talk about this topic. So, thank you once again for having me on.
No, it's absolutely our pleasure. So a few weeks ago, Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin used that example. They're talking all about Ukraine, of course. And Putin used that example, that opportunity, to sort of go back to the 9th century to talk about relations between Ukraine and Russia, or even using those words are problematic. Now, there was some backlash in the mainstream media, on the BBC and Twitter, and people like Tom Holland and whatever, claiming Putin was just factually wrong about all sorts of things. And you did what I thought was a superb stream, and you did say a few times it was off the cuff. It didn't seem like it was off the cuff. It was a great example of somebody that's got a fantastic amount of knowledge. You've got far more than I have, so I'm hoping to pick your brain in this. But Putin decided to go back to the 9th century, to go back to Rurik in the 860s, to sort of start his story, start his narrative there. I think one of the things overall you were saying is that Putin might have been wrong here or there, especially in the more modern era, in sort of the 20th century era, but what he wasn't necessarily all that factually inaccurate, but what he was doing was conflating things, and there was some sort of few lies by omission here and there. So I thought we could just dig into it, if that's all right with you. So one of the first things I wanted to say or ask, and it's a giant question which probably hasn't really got a straightforward answer, but sort of where does Russia as a state begin? I'm sure there's all sorts of arguments. Different people would argue different things. Where does Ukraine begin? I mean, so for example, let's just start here. Would you start the story of Russia, whatever that means, with Rurik, the Scandinavian, the Varangian? What would he be in modern sense, a Swede or something? What do you think about Putin starting his story with Rurik in the 9th century?
Well, something you could perhaps criticize Putin about here is what exactly does it mean to be a state, and what do we mean by starting Russia? I mean, are we starting Russia as a culture? Are we starting Russia as a civilization? I mean, it may not seem very significant to, I don't know, a lay person listening to this sort of information, used to these terms being used interchangeably, but they are important because I would say they demark different points in history. You're right in the sense that he was a Swede. I mean, it's probably more appropriate in the 9th century to say that Rurik was a Viking. Okay. But in terms of, I don't know, the gathering of something that could be considered a quote unquote Rus civilization, that being some sort of Viking East Slavic amalgamation, I think you can look at that as an origin point. What Putin specifically was trying to do in terms of drawing this back to modern Russian history and the history of Ukraine is by saying that this history began with the foundation of two cities, Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. And that, of course, is a testament to the fact that the Russians began their civilization as great seafarers, and then, of course, greater river navigators. They were able to dominate the rivers of the Volga, the Dnieper, and using that, they were actually able to destroy the Khazars and other sort of nomadic conquerors found in that region. But that essentially is why Putin brought up the history going back to that point, is that he believes that the origin of the actual Ukrainian heartland, one could say, around the city of Kiev, is in itself a foundational city for the creation of a Rus civilization, which he believes to be a Russian civilization. It may be confusing etymologically to use these terms, because when Putin says Russia, he means Rus, whereas virtually all historiographers in the West will use Rus and Russia as separate entities. And the reason I would always put an asterisk behind using either Russia or Rus, it's to demarcate the difference between the point you brought up at the beginning, between a culture and a state. With Russia, we have the beginning, I would say, of a state, which is what most Western historians are used to referring to as. With Rus, we have the beginning of a civilization. Hopefully that answers your question.
So a Russian state certainly doesn't go back to the 9th century around Kiev. That's wrong to say that, right?
Civilization.
That's not Russia, isn't it? Right, there's no continuity between the 9th century Kievan Rus around Kiev on the Dnieper and the modern state of Russia in the 21st century. Is that right?
There is a continuity.
Okay.
It's very complicated because there's a lot of nuance in terms of referring to this, and this is why I'm trying to be as favourable and charitable to people like Timothy Snyder as possible and Tom Holland, and say that Timothy Snyder more so because he's an actual historian of Ukraine as opposed to Tom Holland, where they don't really understand the nuances, the terms, and maybe they're taking the literal interpretation of what Putin said and then roundly dismissing him as entirely wrong. My objection is that he believes the origin of the modern Rus civilization begins with Rurik, when I believe that's incredibly contentious. My specific contention is that he believed it was the beginning of a centralized Russian state, which is absolutely ludicrous. But in terms of trying to trace
that's what I meant really, as a centralized state, because that's what Putin said, wasn't it? Those were his words, at least in translation. And that is incorrect to say that, right?
Yes. I mean, just to give you an overview of how you can draw some sort of state continuity, just for the sake of clarification. At the beginning of during the middle of the 9th century through to the 10th century, we have a series of Rurikid sort of principalities, I think is a fair word to say, but they're more or less bandit communities. One of the first things the Russians did upon entering into the world stage is attempt to sack Constantinople. So they were little more than Visigoths or sort of tribal raiders of antiquity, if you sort of put them in the great scheme of nomadic conquerors, of which there were so many from the 4th century up until really, you could say, the Hungarians in the 10th century. You can sort of slot the original Rus into those sort of peoples. But the point that Putin was making in terms of, again, he contradicts himself several times. I think this could have used a script doctor or something if he was, like, I do almost believe it was off the cuff for him, which would excuse a few points. But going back to this point about a continuity of Rus statehood, it really seemed that he was implicitly saying that it begins with Vladimir the Great, who was the great ruler who Christianized the Rus and formed an alliance with the Byzantines. And it's from there you can say that the Rus eschewed the idea of essentially being great nomadic, semi-nomadic conquerors, or sort of bandit principalities, and they decided to quote unquote civilize. It should be noted, however, that Vladimir the Great didn't have some sort of absolute predilection towards Christianity, as Putin claimed, due to the influence of his grandmother, Princess Olga. But he had actually tried to synthesize all of the pagan religions in Russia at the time. And then he'd actually gone out and sent emissaries to try and form an alliance with the Pope and other factions like this. And but ultimately he decided to yield to the soft power of Constantinople.
So that Vladimir the Great, Vladimir the First, or is Saint Vladimir, isn't he? So that's then that we're talking the late 10th century at that point.
Yes, the late 10th century and the early 11th century. And from Putin's perspective, we can then draw from that again, in terms of centralized state, this is why I find the term very anathema. You have you can say a hierarchy of principalities. You have Kiev, and one of the reasons why this existed is because the Rus civilization or the pre-Russian civilization was so big. It was almost impossible in terms of being able to exert a unified state across such a large, disparate and depopulated region, other than through dominating a series of river forts, essentially. And through these river forts tended to be the steading of a Rurikid prince, and the Rurikid prince was shown nominal deference to the Grand Prince, who was situated in Kiev. But again, that is, you can say, the origin of a Rus statehood, whether it's a Russian statehood, again, really comes down to your use of terminology. And I believe that Putin sees this as a continuity of Russian statehood. We look at figures such as Saint Vladimir, Vladimir the Great. We go to Yaroslav the Wise, and then we try and form a connection between some of these principalities, which have a connection to Kiev, and then draw this to the foundation of Moscow. And the problem in terms of being able to draw a link between this is the Mongol invasion. But just to ignore the Mongol invasion and try to almost create a domino effect in terms of where Moscow fits into this. Kiev remains a sort of the great sort of jewel of Rus civilization during the 11th century until it's sacked during one of these perennial disputes over succession, which dominated the Rurikid princes. They were basically in a permanent state of civil war throughout the later 11th and 12th centuries before the Mongols came. But from Moscow, we then see the supremacy of the Rus moving to a city called Vladimir, and the principality is called Vladimir Suzdal. All of these cities, Kiev and Vladimir Suzdal, are sacked, and basically their statehood is destroyed by the Mongols. And so the primacy of the Rus then moves to a city in the north, which was one of the founding cities of the Rus called Novgorod. And from Novgorod, the Prince Alexander Nevsky decides to give all of his sons principalities in the new sort of post-Mongol Rus civilization. And one of these princes is Daniel, who inherits Moscow. So that is you can say the link in terms of a continuity of Russian statehood, is that we go from Kiev to Vladimir to Novgorod to Moscow. And indeed, when Moscow was basically under the yoke of the Mongols, the other princes around Moscow would compete for a title, the Grand Prince of Vladimir, explicitly linking back to the older city, Vladimir Suzdal, which had inherited that original primacy from the Rus during the 12th century. I know this sounds very complicated, but if I'm going to delve deep into Russian medieval history, you can draw a very, very tentative link between all of these things, and of course the continuity of the Rurik dynasty. However, my main contention again is the use of the word state, and in extreme with the use of the word centralized state.
So with the Mongols, that's the pardon me, that's the Golden Horde, right? The Golden Horde Mongols.
Well, the Mongols, the Golden Horde was a ulus, or a division of the Mongols.
Sure, yeah, but that's the one that sort of went through, Moscow, right?
Well, yes. I mean, it's if I recall, did you and Carl talk about Subutai at one point, or am I?
No, we haven't yet. We've done Attila the Hun, obviously much hundreds of years earlier, and we're going to do Genghis and then the heirs of Genghis. So we haven't actually done it yet, but we've threatened to a number of times. It is on the docket, but we haven't actually done it yet.
Well, this may amuse you then, because Subutai is one of these sort of great general adventurers throughout history. I mean, I would almost say he's the Mongol equivalent of some sort of Hernan Cortez sort of figure. He leads the scouting missions ahead of the main Mongol host. So while Genghis Khan is ruining the Khwarezmian Empire, Subutai is going through the Caucasus and pillaging and raping those kingdoms along the Caucasus. But then, of course, in what you can say to be the most successful scouting mission ever, he goes further. He attacks I believe it's the chronology of these sort of tribes sort of escapes me sometimes, but I believe it was the Kuman Kipchaks he encountered. But then he went off to encounter the Rus. And the Rus, for one of their first times in history, since Yaroslav the Wise, came out with a united army to face the Mongols under Subutai. And I've equivocated this with the Russian version of Agincourt, because the Rus came out and they were massacred. Basically, the original aristocracy of the Rurikid princes were annihilated by Subutai. And those that survived were placed under essentially you can say it's basically like a dance platform, and were crushed as the Mongols were celebrating on top of them. Really quite horrifying stuff. And then the rest of the Rurikid princes, the ones who had escaped the battle and survived, most of them basically came into some form of tributary relation with the Ottomans when they came around for a second time under Ogadai Khan and Batu Khan. They razed all the great cities, having already annihilated the cream of the Russian aristocracy. And they attack and destroy the great cities, like I said, of Kiev and Vladimir. And after the Mongols finally retreat, having nearly conquered Poland and Hungary in the 1240s, then they essentially carve out one of the, I believe it's a nephew or a cousin of Genghis Khan, Batu Khan, carves out a section of his empire, which is the Golden Horde. And it's that Golden Horde which is going to adopt the incredibly complicated system of tributary sort of overlord state vis-a-vis all the Russian princes up until the late 15th century.
I was just saying, so that sort of all begins there, or is it sort of 13th century stuff? So, you can trust the Mongols to... It's terrifying, actually, isn't it? There was nothing to stop them going all the way through Central and even Western Europe. If history had played out slightly differently, you could have had Mongol hordes in France or something. Who knows? But anyway,
Frederick the Second, Frederick Stupamundi Hohenzollern, who had conquered Jerusalem in a crusade, one of his final acts as emperor was actually to gather a great imperial host of the Italians and the Germans to defend Bohemia and defend what was then essentially Austria from the Mongol host, had they not been delivered by Ogedai's premature death, and they all went back scurrying to the Kurultai. So yes, that was a possibility.
I mean, who knows if the Hohenzollern allies would have been...
Hohenstaufen.
Hohenstaufen, sorry. I was going to say, so much later, isn't it? Much later. Yeah. But anyway, who knows whether that coalition would have stopped the Mongols? Who knows? But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. One thing, actually, can we go back in time a little bit, back to Vladimir I and the so-called baptism of Russia, again in the 10th century, right? Do you put much or any real emphasis on that? Let's drop the word centralised. If where Putin was talking about a centralised state, let's drop the centralised bit, because anyone who's being reasonable wouldn't go along with that. But just the idea of a state or some sort of predecessor state in which the modern or later medieval and then modern states were formed out of. Do you put much emphasis on that baptism of Russia, or do you think that's something that there isn't really any continuity between that and now? What are your feelings about that?
Well, barring his attempt to reconcile Soviet history with the grand continuity of Russian history, I believe that's an essential component of Putin's argument here, is that he believes to be Russian is to be Orthodox. And the literal baptism of Russia came in the form of Vladimir the Great yielding to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was then based in Constantinople.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.